The morning sun crept over the Solomon Islands on April 18, 1943, its rays dancing off the emerald waters like firelight through glass. In the stillness of that Pacific dawn, 6 Japanese Zero fighters sliced through the sky in formation, each one piloted by a man chosen for what would become the most important mission of his life, and, for most, the last. Their objective wasn't to win a battle, seize an island, or down an enemy aircraft. It was far more sacred: protect Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy and the man behind the attack on Pearl Harbor. 17 minutes from now, he would be dead. This is not a story about dogfights or aerial heroics. It's about failure, the kind that haunts those who survive it. A failure not born of cowardice, but of doctrine, technology, and fate conspiring against 6 of Japan's finest fighter pilots. These men weren't rookies. They were hardened veterans of the Pacific Air War, men who had survived Guadalcanal and dueled with American fighters more times than they could count. Yet on that morning, against overwhelming odds and a foe who knew their every move in advance, they were destined to fall short. The mission had been cloaked in secrecy. The day before, at the 204th Naval Air Group's base in Rabaul, the 6 were briefed. Lieutenant Teishi Morisaki, with 2 years of aerial combat etched into his soul, stood quietly as he received the assignment. Alongside him were Shoichi Sugita, an ace with 30 victories; Yoshimi Hidaka, another top ace with a keen tactical mind; Kenji Yanaga, famed for his gunnery precision; Toyomitsu Tsujinu, a rock-steady pilot with nerves of steel; and the youngest, Yasushi Okazaki, blooded in battle but burning with potential. They were told they would be flying escort for Yamamoto on an inspection tour of the South Pacific. It was the highest honor they could be given. It was also a death sentence they could not see coming. What none of them knew, what no Japanese officer could have imagined, was that 4,000 miles away in Hawaii, American codebreakers had cracked the unthinkable. They had Yamamoto's entire itinerary in their hands: flight times, routes, landings, all transmitted in the JN-25D naval code the Japanese believed unbreakable. But it wasn't. The Americans had seen the message. They had a plan, Operation Vengeance, they called it. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, a unit of P-38 Lightning fighters was preparing for a mission that pushed the very limits of their aircraft. The numbers were grim. The distance to the interception point near Bougainville was 420 miles, just within range if they flew perfectly, fuel to the last drop. Major John Mitchell, leading the 339th Fighter Squadron, worked through the night with maps and math, calibrating every angle and minute. 18 P-38s were assigned. 16 would take off. Only one was fated to fall. Back in Rabaul, the Japanese pilots readied their Zeros. The A6M3 Model 22 was a remarkable aircraft, though by 1943, new designs were emerging. Built for agility, its design was suited for an earlier era of aviation. It faced new challenges against more recent aircraft. For the 6 pilots who took off that morning, their focus was entirely on the task at hand. Their hearts were full of resolve. They were committed to escorting a respected leader and ensuring his safety. As the planes soared into the sky, the outcome of their important mission was a story waiting to unfold. The jungle of Bougainville lay still beneath the buzz of propellers, unaware it would soon witness one of the most precise ambushes in aviation history. The 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers flew low and steady, sleek silhouettes against the vast Pacific sky. Inside bomber number 303 sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, clad in a crisp white uniform, unaware that his fate had been sealed days ago by a radio intercept half a world away. The second bomber, number 326, carried Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki and several senior staff members. Above and behind them flew 6 Guardians, Japan's best, or so they had been told. At 6,500 feet, the Zeros maintained their doctrine-formed formation, high and slightly back, a classic setup from earlier wars when threats came from above in diving attacks. It was a defensive posture developed against obsolete aircraft, flown by ill-trained Chinese pilots in the late 1930s. But it had not evolved with the war. And war, like the machines that fight it, does not wait for slow minds to catch up. Meanwhile, far below, a different kind of thunder stirred. 16 P-38 Lightnings screamed across the waves at treetop height, invisible to radar, ghost-like against the sea. They flew in silence. No radios, no chatter, just compass headings and synchronized watches guiding them along a labyrinthian route to one precise minute in the sky. They were the cutting edge, twin-engined, turbocharged, faster and deadlier than anything the Japanese had seen before. And they knew exactly when and where to strike. At precisely 0934 hours, Major John Mitchell's top-cover flight spotted the formation. 2 bombers escorted by 6 Zeros, right where the decoded message said they'd be. A miracle of navigation, a catastrophe for Yamamoto. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber, leading the killer flight, peeled off from the others, diving up from the treetops to meet their targets. From above, the Japanese pilots saw nothing but blue sky. They watched, tense but composed, scanning the heavens for American fighters. Their eyes never dropped to the jungle below. That was their blind spot. And that was where death waited. Lieutenant Morisaki saw it too late. A flash of motion, a blur rising from the trees. He shouted a warning even as he rolled his Zero into a dive, but it was already over. Rex Barber had found his mark. From just 50 yards behind, he unleashed a storm of 50 caliber rounds and 20mm shells into the Betty carrying Yamamoto. The right engine exploded into flame, the fuselage peeled apart. Inside, a single round tore through the Admiral's shoulder and exited beneath his eye. Death was instant, brutal, and final. The bomber began to list, then nosedived into the canopy below. The Zeros reacted like seasoned warriors, diving to engage, but physics would not be denied. They were 1,500 feet too high, too far back. Their aircraft were too slow to catch the departing P-38s, now climbing out of range with fire trailing behind them. Barber was already pulling away. The mission was complete. In those final seconds, the escort pilots did everything they could. Morisaki pulled through a split S maneuver to dive faster. Hidaka banked toward Barber's position. Yanaga, on the far right, caught a glimpse of a straggling P-38 limping with one engine. He gave chase. But the Americans had done what they came to do, and they were already leaving. Petty Officer Kenji Yanaga stayed locked on the damaged P-38, his eyes narrowing behind the cockpit glass as he pushed the throttle forward. The American fighter was losing altitude, trailing smoke and fuel, its left engine sputtering erratically. Yanaga knew he had only moments. The others were pulling away, disappearing back toward Guadalcanal, but this one was his. He closed the distance steadily, pressing his thumb to the cannon trigger. A burst of 20mm shells flared from his Zero. He saw them strike true, wing, fuselage, more fuel streaming into the air. But the American pilot held on, struggling to keep the wounded Lightning aloft. The rugged machine refused to go down, its single engine groaning against the laws of gravity. Yanaga chased him for miles, pushing the Zero to its limits, his ammunition nearly gone. But there was no final blow. Eventually, with fuel low and friendly skies far behind, he was forced to break off. He banked hard and turned back toward Balalai Airfield, his mission a failure, his kill incomplete. That P-38 would never make it home. The sea would claim it. But the cost had already been paid in full. As he returned to base, Yanaga replayed the ambush in his mind. The Zeros had been in the right place. They had followed their orders, maintained formation, scanned the skies, and still they had failed. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a failure of execution, but of the system itself. The aircraft, the tactics, the assumptions, none of it had worked when it counted most. At Balalai, the other 5 pilots had already landed. Their aircraft untouched, engines ticking as they cooled in the island heat. The silence on the tarmac was suffocating. No cheers, no briefings, no words at all. Each man sat alone in the cockpit of his guilt, knowing they had been chosen for honor and had returned with disgrace. The shock of Admiral Yamamoto's death struck like a thunderclap. He had been more than a commander. He was the strategist who foresaw Japan's limitations and strengths with rare clarity. The mastermind behind Pearl Harbor. The only man who understood what a war against American industry truly meant. And now he was gone, killed in a mission that should have been routine. The loss reverberated through the Japanese Navy like a tremor through glass. No official blame was assigned, but everyone understood. For the 6 pilots, their failure was etched into their identity. Not because they had hesitated or faltered, but because they had done everything right and still lost. In Japanese military culture, shame was collective. It did not matter that they had flown with courage. They had not brought the admiral home. As the sun dipped below the horizon that night, casting long shadows across the jungle floor where Yamamoto's bomber had fallen, the truth settled in. The Americans had known. They had planned this. Somehow they had intercepted every detail: the flight time, the route, the altitude. It had been an execution, not a battle. And for the men who flew that day, it was just the beginning of a darker chapter. Redemption would not come easily. For some, it would never come at all. News of Admiral Yamamoto's death did not immediately reach the Japanese public. Within military circles, however, it spread like wildfire, first in whispers, then in stunned silence. At Rabaul, where the mission began, disbelief gave way to mourning. Officers stood quietly, staring at the radio console as the grim confirmation came through. The Betty bomber had gone down. The admiral was dead, and the 6 men chosen to guard him had failed. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, who had hand-picked the escort from his 204th Naval Air Group, did not speak a word. He simply walked the line of aircraft on the tarmac, pausing in front of each Zero, his hands behind his back, his face unreadable. It was a funeral procession in all but name. For these 6 pilots, the honor of selection had become a lifelong burden. But the war would not pause for grief. Just 2 days after Yamamoto's state funeral on June 5, 1943, the 204th Air Group launched a massive air assault on Allied positions in the Solomon Islands. It was retaliation and penance. The mission targeted the Russell Islands with 81 Zeros, 12 of them armed with firebombs. Among the pilots were 4 of the 6 who had flown the escort mission. For them, it was not just a combat sortie. It was a reckoning. Chief Petty Officer Yoshimi Hidaka and Petty Officer Second Class Yasushi Okazaki never returned. During the 90-minute aerial engagement, they were shot down by a wave of Allied fighters. Both had flown into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire, pushing through the barrage to deliver their payloads. They died as warriors, but their deaths were more than sacrifice. They were, in their own way, an attempt at redemption. That same day, Kenji Yanaga once again took to the skies. His Zero, armed with firebombs, made its attack run over Russell Island. But as he climbed away from the inferno below, 2 American F-4F Wildcats pounced from above. Rounds tore into his cockpit. A bullet struck his right hand, shattering it. Another ripped through his leg, filling his flight boot with blood. Despite the agony, he gritted his teeth and held the stick with his mangled hand, refusing to black out. Yanaga's Zero barely stayed airborne. He shouted into the wind, trying to keep himself conscious, using his left hand to guide the crippled aircraft toward the base at Munda. With landing gear inoperable and nearly unconscious, he belly landed on the coral runway. Japanese Marines dragged him from the wreckage. His right hand was amputated on the spot. His war was over. As he lay recovering in a field hospital, news of Hidaka and Okazaki's deaths reached him. 3 of the 6 were now gone. The number would soon drop again. Lieutenant Teishi Morisaki, the escort flight leader, died 9 days later on June 16th while attacking Allied shipping near Guadalcanal. He was shot down alongside his squadron commander, their aircraft tumbling into the sea in flames. With Morisaki's death, only 2 pilots from the original escort team remained in combat. Their war had become a countdown, each mission a roll of the dice, each engagement a silent prayer. The shame of Yamamoto's death hung over them like a shadow. And for those still flying, survival was not the goal. Atonement was. By July 1st, 1943, the slow unraveling of the Yamamoto escort was nearly complete. Petty Officer First Class Toyomitsu Tsujinu, once the quiet, composed pillar of the group, failed to return from a mission over the Renova Islands. He had been tasked with escorting a formation of dive bombers, a routine duty by wartime standards. But somewhere in the vast skies of the Pacific, his Zero disappeared. No parachute, no radio signal, no wreckage, just absence. He was never seen again. Now only two of the original six remained: Shoichi Sugita, the highest-scoring ace among them, and Kenji Yanaga, grounded by his wounds and adjusting to life with only one hand. For Sugita, flying became something more than duty. It was personal. While the others had sought redemption through sacrifice, he chased it through continued battle. To die once might cleanse shame, but to fight on, to strike back again and again, that was the path he chose. Sugita was relentless. Throughout the summer of 1943, he hunted American aircraft with near-clinical focus. Each kill was a tally, a step further from the memory of that April morning. By August, his total had risen to 40 confirmed victories, making him the top ace in the Solomon Islands campaign. But the war was changing. The Americans were not only more numerous, they were better, more coordinated, more advanced. His first brush with death came that same August. Engaged in an attack on a formation of American bombers, Sugita's Zero was riddled with bullets. The engine caught fire mid-air, smoke choking the cockpit. Most Japanese pilots, sworn to fight to the death, would have ridden the plane into the sea. But Sugita did the unthinkable. He bailed out. Parachuting into Japanese-held territory with severe burns, he was rushed to a field hospital. In the eyes of many of his peers, survival through escape was shameful. But Sugita didn't care. He wasn't done. He saw his survival not as weakness, but as a second chance, a chance to finish what had begun in the skies over Bougainville. After 7 long months of recovery, Sugita returned to active duty in March 1944, posted to the 263rd Air Group in Guam. The war had moved on. The Americans were tightening the noose around the Marianas, and the once-feared Japanese naval aviation was dwindling. That summer, in June 1944, Sugita flew in the largest carrier-based air battle since Midway, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American pilots would call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese forces launched hundreds of aircraft. Few returned. More than 300 were lost in a single day. Sugita's squadron tried to escape to Guam, but 6 Zeros were intercepted by American Hellcats. 5 were blown out of the sky within minutes. Only Sugita survived. His aircraft limped into a base on Rota Island, riddled with holes, navigation gear destroyed. The last of his group. Again. The ghosts were closing in. In the final year of the war, as Japan's skies darkened with the roar of American bombers, Shoichi Sugita's journey neared its end. He had become something of a legend among his peers, a survivor in a world that had little room for them. In January 1945, now a chief petty officer, he joined the 3001st Fighter Squadron, an elite unit within the newly formed 343rd Naval Air Group. Their mission? To defend the Japanese homeland from the coming storm. They flew the Kawanishi N1K2J Shidenkai, a powerful new interceptor designed to match American fighters. For once, Sugita had an aircraft that could fight on equal terms. He embraced the chance. It was perhaps the first time since April 18, 1943, that he felt the odds might be even. But redemption always danced just beyond his reach. On April 15, 1945, almost exactly 2 years to the day after Yamamoto's assassination, American carrier aircraft attacked Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu. F-6F Hellcats from USS Independence and USS Randolph struck at dawn, catching the 343rd on takeoff. Sugita's fighter had just lifted off the runway when enemy fire struck. The aircraft veered, then crashed just beyond the airstrip, exploding into flame. He was 20 years old. With Sugita's death, the final curtain fell on the men who had once been entrusted with protecting Japan's most valuable leader. 5 were now dead. All had met their ends in combat. All except one. Kenji Yanaga lived. After surviving his near-fatal injuries in 1943, he had been sent back to Japan, promoted to warrant officer, and assigned as a flight instructor at Kasumigaura Naval Air Station. He never flew in combat again. With only his left hand functional, he trained younger pilots, boys really, many of whom would die in kamikaze missions before ever seeing real battle. When the war ended in August 1945, Yanaga was one of roughly 5,000 surviving Japanese naval aviators out of more than 25,000 who had served. He returned to Tokyo and found quiet work in a small trading company. The war receded into the past, and with it the story he carried alone. For nearly 30 years, he told no one about the Yamamoto mission. In the mid-1970s, a Japanese aviation historian named Akira Yoshimura began researching the details of Operation Vengeance. His work led him to a startling discovery. One of the escort pilots had survived. Through contacts and careful inquiries, he found Yanaga, now in his 50s, living in quiet obscurity. At first reluctant, Yanaga eventually agreed to speak. What emerged was the first Japanese account of the mission, from someone who had lived it. Yanaga described the pride of being chosen, the tight formation over Bougainville, the sudden violence of the American attack. He spoke of the impossible geometry, the way the P-38s came from below and behind, the fatal blind spot no training had prepared them for. And he made it clear there had never been a real chance to save Yamamoto. 6 fighters could not hold back 16 attackers who knew exactly when and where to strike. His voice was not bitter. It was steady, reflective, tinged with sorrow, but not shame. For the first time, the world heard the other side of the story. Not the victor's version, but the testimony of a man who had tried and failed and lived to remember it. In April 1988, 45 years after the mission that shattered the Japanese Naval Command, a remarkable invitation crossed the Pacific Ocean. The National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, Admiral Nimitz's hometown, was organizing a symposium commemorating Operation Vengeance. They reached out to the surviving American pilots of the mission, but through a network of Japanese historians and military enthusiasts, they extended a second, more unexpected offer, an invitation to Kenji Yanaga. He accepted. At age 68, Yanaga boarded a plane to America for the first time. The flight was long, the emotions heavier still. What would he say to the men who had killed the admiral he was sworn to protect? How would they look at him, a former enemy, the last witness to their victory? These questions lingered as the Texas plains came into view, far from the jungles of Bougainville, where it all began. When he arrived at the symposium, the moment was quiet, almost surreal. 8 American pilots were in attendance, veterans of the mission who had trained in silence, flown into the unknown, and returned with history forever changed. Among them was Rex Barber, the man credited with shooting down Yamamoto's bomber. Yanaga approached slowly, carrying a small gift in both hands. It was a handheld compass. He extended it to Major John Mitchell, the mission's commanding officer, a gesture of respect, of understanding, of closure. There were handshakes, nods, and long searching glances. Not all pain can be spoken. But in that room, across lines once drawn in blood, something unspoken passed between them. They were soldiers, men who had done what they were told, who carried the weight of decisions made far above their ranks. Video footage captured parts of the event, panel discussions, quiet interviews, hesitant laughter. Yanaga sat alongside Americans like Frank Holmes, Jack Jacobson, and Roger Ames. They compared flight paths, combat maneuvers, and memories long buried. It was not reconciliation in the political sense. It was something older, something deeper. Warriors recognizing one another across the battlefield of memory. During his official oral history interview, Yanaga repeated what he had told Yoshimura years earlier. They had been ambushed. The Americans had come from below, perfectly timed, perfectly placed. The Zeros were not flawed in courage, but in doctrine. Their formation had been appropriate for a different war, not one shaped by code-breaking and high-speed interceptions. He emphasized that even if they had seen the P-38s a few seconds earlier, it would not have made a difference. He spoke without self-pity, without theatrics, just facts, just the truth as he had lived it. After the symposium, Yanaga returned to Tokyo, but the silence he had once kept about the mission no longer held. Over the next 2 decades, he gave occasional interviews, participated in documentaries, and shared his insights with historians around the world. He never sought the spotlight, but he understood the weight of memory and his unique responsibility to carry it. He was the last man alive who had seen Admiral Yamamoto's death with his own eyes. In time, the story he carried, the quiet pain, the impossible odds, the fateful minutes, became not just a tale of loss, but a reflection of how war devours even the best intentions, and of how sometimes survival is its own kind of burden. Kenji Yanaga lived quietly through the years following the symposium. He never sought to become a symbol, but that's what he became. Not of triumph or failure, but of witness, of the thin, fragile thread that connects the present to the brutal clarity of the past. In Tokyo, he continued working at the same small trading company, the same desk, the same streets walked daily. But after Texas, he carried himself differently. Not lighter, no, but perhaps straighter. The shame that once clung to him like fog had lifted, if only slightly. The world had listened. His story was out. Over time, journalists and filmmakers sought him out. His face appeared in documentaries on both sides of the Pacific. Always reserved, always factual, he never turned his memories into theater. When asked about that day, he'd recount it as a sequence of moments, each one sharp, each one irreversible. He'd describe the shape of the American planes as they rose from the treetops, the way the Zero's cockpit glared under the sun, the silence on the radio as Yamamoto's bomber began to fall. He never blamed the Americans. If anything, he admired the precision, the courage, the quiet ruthlessness of Operation Vengeance. His bitterness, what little he had, was directed inward, toward the doctrine that had failed them, the overconfidence that had allowed a war machine like Japan's to believe their codes were unbreakable, their plans unknowable. He often said the same phrase in interviews. It was not our weakness, it was their preparation. In time, his name became synonymous with the Yamamoto mission in historical circles. Books cited him. Veterans, American and Japanese alike, began referring to him simply as the last pilot. And he wore that quietly, a final echo of an era fading into dust. As he aged into his 80s, his health declined, but his mind remained sharp. On February 29, 2008, Kenji Yanaga passed away in Tokyo. He was 88 years old. No grand ceremony marked his death, no headlines flashed across the news. But for those who had studied the war, for those who knew what he had carried alone for decades, it was the closing of a chapter. He had been the last living man who saw one of World War II's most decisive moments unfold, from the losing side, and yet his story was not about loss alone. It was about endurance, about memory, about the strange loneliness of survival when all the others are gone. With Yanaga's death, the story of the Yamamoto escort passed fully from living memory into history. But history, if listened to carefully, still echoes. His voice, preserved in recordings, in transcripts, in worn photographs and silent documentaries, continues to speak. He tells us that courage isn't always enough. That skill cannot always overcome planning. That loyalty, even the purest kind, can be crushed by a failure of imagination at the top. And that sometimes the men who survive are left not with glory, but with the heavy silence of what might have been. But he also reminds us, even in defeat, truth matters. And someone must live to tell it. In the years after the war, as both America and Japan rebuilt in radically different ways, the deeper meaning of Admiral Yamamoto's death remained a subject of quiet study among historians, veterans, and military strategists. It was easy to see Operation Vengeance as a tactical victory, precise, clean, executed with minimal American losses. But for those who looked closer, it was something more profound, a moment where an entire military doctrine unraveled in a single violent minute. At the heart of that unraveling was the aircraft that had once symbolized Japanese aerial dominance, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. In 1940, the Zero had stunned the world. It was light, fast, and agile, able to outturn and outclimb nearly every enemy it faced. Its early success was legendary, particularly in the skies over China and during the early Pacific offensives. But its design had been built on a single dangerous assumption that agility and range were worth more than armor or survivability. By 1943, that assumption had become lethal. The very qualities that had made the Zero dominant now made it vulnerable. Its lack of self-sealing fuel tanks meant that a single incendiary round could ignite it. Its lack of armor meant pilots often died from glancing hits. And perhaps most fatally, its speed had been surpassed by American designs like the P-38 Lightning. In combat, that meant the Americans could choose when to fight and when to leave. During the Yamamoto mission, these weaknesses were brutally exposed. The 6 escorting Zeros, flying A6M3 Model 22s, had slightly improved engines and high-altitude capabilities, but they were no match for the twin-engined, turbo-supercharged P-38s. The Americans approached low and fast, flying below radar detection with enough firepower to shred a bomber in seconds. The Japanese formation, flying by doctrine, not adaptation, was positioned to repel attacks from above. But the Americans came from below. It was a perfect storm of miscalculation. The Japanese assumed their codes were secure. They assumed Yamamoto's presence would remain secret. They assumed their tactics were sufficient. All of these assumptions failed, and when they did, no amount of bravery or training could alter the outcome. The 6 pilots who escorted Yamamoto that day were not to blame. They flew with discipline. They reacted with speed. But they were placed in an unwinnable position by a military system that had not evolved. In many ways, their failure was not theirs alone. It was the failure of a nation unable to adjust its thinking in time. And yet, it's important to remember who they were, not just as symbols of a broader failure, but as individuals. Young men in their early 20s, combat veterans, sons, warriors who believed in their duty and faced their deaths not with cowardice, but conviction. They were not reckless. They were not incompetent. They were simply outmatched. And perhaps most tragically, they were alone. The American pilots returned to celebration and medals. Their mission became legend. The Japanese pilots who survived returned to silence, to internal shame, to a culture that valued success more than sacrifice. In time, most of their names would fade. Only one, Kenji Yanaga, would live to speak them again. Their story, once hidden in the shadows of classified war reports and state-controlled narratives, now flickers in history's light. Not as villains, not as victims, but as men caught in the grinding gears of a war that no longer made room for old ways. As historians pieced together the events of April 18, 1943, a question haunted their analysis like a ghostly refrain. Could anything have been done to prevent Yamamoto's death? Not from the American side. Operation Vengeance had been a masterpiece of intelligence and timing, but from the Japanese. Could different decisions, altered tactics, or more foresight have changed the outcome? The brutal answer is, probably not. The failure wasn't in a single decision or moment. It was systemic, a convergence of outdated doctrine, misplaced confidence, and the relentless march of American technological advancement. The Imperial Japanese Navy's over-reliance on tradition and hierarchy had blinded it to the evolution of aerial warfare. The belief that their codes were unbreakable, that their pilots were unmatched, and that their aircraft still ruled the skies created an illusion of control that crumbled under the weight of reality. The most damning element was the transmission itself, Yamamoto's itinerary, broadcast in clear detail through a cipher that the Americans had been decoding for months. It included departure times, arrival points, even what time lunch would be served. It was not just a breach of security, it was an open invitation. And the Americans accepted. The formation of the escort, 2 V-shaped groups of 3 Zeros each, was textbook for 1939. Positioned 1,500 feet above and behind the bombers, it provided protection against high-speed dives from enemy fighters. But that setup was irrelevant in 1943. American pilots no longer fought that way. They didn't dive in from the sun. They came in low, fast, unseen, and struck before their targets could even react. The 6 escorting pilots had no warning until the P-38s were within firing range. By the time they saw them, Yamamoto's bomber had already been shredded. Even if the Zeros had flown closer, even if they had broken formation earlier, even if they had spotted the incoming fighters seconds sooner, it likely wouldn't have mattered. The P-38 Lightning's superior speed and firepower meant that it could engage, destroy, and disengage before the Zeros could bring their agility to bear. The Japanese pilots were trained to fight prolonged turning battles. The Americans were trained to hit and vanish. The P-38s jettisoned their drop tanks, made their attack, and were gone. The entire engagement lasted barely 4 minutes. In the aftermath, some within the Japanese military speculated that the Americans had been tipped off. A leak, perhaps. A spy. But the truth was far more devastating. The Americans had simply listened. They had cracked the JN-25D code and had been reading Japanese communications for months. including the ones coordinating Operation I-Go and its aftermath. That overconfidence in encrypted communication cost them their greatest strategist. Admiral Yamamoto had warned Japan years earlier of the dangers of prolonged war with the United States. He had studied at Harvard. He had toured America's industrial heartland. He knew, more than any other Japanese leader, the scale of American production and resolve. His death silenced a voice of cautious realism in a high command, increasingly driven by ideology and desperation. After the mission, the wreckage of his bomber was discovered in the jungle of Bougainville. His body, still in his uniform, was recovered and cremated. Tokyo declared him a national hero. A state funeral was held. The emperor himself attended, but the public never learned the truth. Not then. To them, Yamamoto had died directing operations at the front, a noble death, a loyal servant. But behind closed doors, his loss sent shockwaves through the Navy. Confidence faltered, morale slipped, and among the men who had been entrusted with his life, a deep, wordless shame settled in, a shadow that would never lift. As Japan's naval air power continued to deteriorate in the face of relentless American advances, the legacy of the 6 Zero pilots who escorted Admiral Yamamoto faded into the fog of war. The 204th Naval Air Group, their parent unit, suffered devastating losses throughout 1943, hemorrhaging aircraft and experienced men with each successive operation. Originally formed from the renamed 6th Air Group in November 1942, the 204th had been forged in the crucible of the Solomon Islands campaign. These were not green recruits, they were hardened veterans of Rabaul, Leh, and Guadalcanal. And yet, by year's end, few would remain. The attrition was not just physical, but spiritual. The death of Yamamoto had broken something unspoken within them. Back in Tokyo, official narratives moved on. The state needed heroes, not ghosts. Pilots who died in combat were celebrated. Those who survived but failed were quietly reassigned or forgotten. In this culture, where collective shame trumped individual accountability, the Yamamoto escort were neither condemned nor honored. They simply disappeared from public memory. Except for Sugita, Gita, and Yanaga. Shoichi Sugita's final act in the spring of 1945 had been recorded by his comrades. He had taken off into a sky filled with American fighters, trying to scramble as bombs fell on Kanoya. He never stood a chance. But in his last moments, he died doing what he believed could wash away the failure of that day 2 years earlier, fighting. Kenji Yanaga, however, had been forced to live. His right hand gone, his cockpit days over, Yanaga trained new recruits in the final desperate years of the war. He watched boys, some barely out of school, climb into aircraft that had little chance of returning. He did what he could, passing on what knowledge remained. But the war had changed. It was no longer about skill, it had become about sacrifice. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Yanaga was quietly discharged and returned to civilian life. He found employment, buried himself in work, and spoke nothing of the war. Even his closest colleagues had no idea who he had once been. To them, he was a quiet man with a damaged hand and a distant look in his eyes. The war crimes trials began, the cities were rebuilt, and a new Japan emerged. Democratic, pacifist, modern. But for men like Yanaga, the transformation was not so easy. The past was not something that could be paved over with highways or silenced by policy. It lived in memories, in scars, in silence. Only decades later did history begin to catch up. As scholars, authors, and filmmakers sought to re-examine the Pacific War through both lenses, Japanese and American, the Yamamoto mission became a point of intersection, not just for what it accomplished, but for what it revealed. Here was a case study in technological mismatch, intelligence superiority, and doctrinal collapse. But it was also a human story. 6 men were told to guard the unguardable, sent into the sky in machines that could no longer compete, told to defend a man whose itinerary had already been handed to the enemy. They had been brave. But bravery wasn't enough, and as their stories returned from the archives into public awareness, so too did the question, what does it mean to fail with honor? Yanaga's life, his silence, his reluctant testimony decades later. It all formed an answer, an imperfect one, but the only one possible in a world where victory and defeat are often separated by information unseen and seconds lost. In the twilight years of his life, Kenji Yanaga had become something he never expected: a reluctant steward of a forgotten history. As historical accounts revisited the events of April 1943 and scholars sought a deeper understanding, Yanaga's perspective was essential. He alone could describe the experience of being in that cockpit, navigating the skies and facing incredible challenges. Yet he always shifted the focus away from himself. In every interview and appearance, he spoke about the other 5 pilots, the companions who had flown beside him, the ones who did not return from that flight. He spoke of Lieutenant Teishi Morisaki, the flight leader whose calm demeanor provided reassurance; of Shoichi Sugita, the skilled pilot who demonstrated great resolve until the very end; of Yoshimi Hidaka, quiet and methodical, who had hoped to become a schoolteacher one day; of Toyomitsu Tsujinu, who always remained steady and composed; of young Yasushi Okazaki, eager, fearless, and gone too soon. And in remembering them, Yanaga reminded the world that they were not failures. They were warriors who had been tasked with the impossible. Time had stripped the war of its immediacy. The black and white photographs, the declassified cables, the rusting wreckage in the Bougainville jungle, they were remnants, echoes. But in Yanaga's voice, there was still life, still regret, still reverence. He often visited war memorials alone, never in uniform, never for fanfare. Just a man standing among names carved into stone. Sometimes, on April 18th, he would rise early and go for a long walk. No destination, just motion, as if retracing a path only he could see. When asked late in life if he forgave himself, his answer was as quiet as it was firm. "There is nothing to forgive. I flew as I was taught, we all did, but the war had changed, and we had not." That awareness, the slow erosion of tradition in the face of modern warfare, defined his later reflections. The Zero pilots were trained in a code of honor built on individual skill, discipline, and loyalty. But against an enemy armed with radar, intelligence intercepts, and superior machines, that code had become a beautiful, tragic relic. Still, he insisted the men deserved remembrance, not just for what they did, but for what they represented: the end of one age of war and the birth of another. On his final trip to Bougainville, arranged by a documentary crew, Yanaga stood at the crash site of bomber number 323. The jungle had begun to reclaim it. Vines twisted through the fuselage, rust painting the metal like dried blood. He didn't speak for a long time. He simply stared. When he finally did speak, it was to no one in particular. "We were too slow, but we came anyway." And in that simple sentence, the whole war seemed to echo. As historians continued dissecting the Pacific War's turning points, the ambush that killed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto emerged as one of its most symbolic, not just for its precision, but for what it revealed about the fault lines within the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was a moment when individual valor collided with the realities of modern warfare and shattered. American success in Operation Vengeance rested on 3 pillars: superior intelligence, superior technology, and evolving tactics. Japan, for all its warrior spirit, had fallen behind in each. The breaking of the JN-25D naval cipher was an intelligence masterstroke. American codebreakers, working tirelessly in darkened rooms, had pulled the veil back on the most secret movements of the Japanese command structure. And yet, even as Yamamoto's travel plans reached Washington, the Japanese Navy remained oblivious. So confident were they in their security that the admiral's schedule was transmitted unencrypted on tactical frequencies, effectively handing the Americans his exact location and timing. Technologically, the contrast was just as stark. The Mitsubishi A6M0, once feared for its range and agility, was now hopelessly outclassed. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines, long-range tanks, and heavy firepower, represented the industrial ingenuity and adaptability of American design. It didn't need to turn tighter than the Zero. It simply flew faster, hit harder, and left the scene before a dogfight could even begin. And in the air, the American pilots followed a new gospel: boom and zoom. No turning fights, no prolonged engagements. Attack at speed from an unexpected angle and disappear. It was tactical evolution, and the Zeros had no counter. Yet despite all this, the story of the Yamamoto escorts remains deeply human. It is not a tale of incompetence or cowardice. It is a study in limits. Shoichi Sugita didn't die because he wasn't skilled. He was one of the most lethal pilots of the campaign. Morisaki wasn't unprepared. He flew his formation exactly as doctrine demanded. Hidaka, Okazaki, Tsujinu, they all followed the training and tactics handed down from the veterans of China and the early Pacific strikes. They did not lose because they were weak. They lost because the war had outpaced them. And for Kenji Yanaga, who returned home with an amputated hand and a lifetime of silence, the tragedy was not just the death of an admiral. It was the death of an era. In the final years of his life, he warned young historians not to oversimplify the story. It wasn't just that the Americans had better planes or better intelligence. It was that Japan had stopped listening to the world, to the pace of change, to the warnings of men like Yamamoto himself, who had once famously told his government that fighting the United States would awaken a sleeping giant. The giant had awoken, and by April 1943, it was learning to walk faster. The wreckage of Yamamoto's bomber still lies in the jungle, a memorial in rust and silence. The names of the 6 pilots who failed to protect him are etched in footnotes, known best through the voice of one man who lived long enough to be asked about them. In that silence, in that rusted metal and unmarked grave of doctrine, is a lesson, not just for soldiers, but for nations. Adapt, or be outflown. By the time Kenji Yanaga passed away in 2008, the war he had survived had long since been consigned to documentaries and classroom discussions. But in the final interviews he gave, there was one theme he returned to again and again. They were not meant to win that day. The mission had been doomed before their wheels left the ground, and yet they flew anyway. The 6 pilots of April 18, 1943, did not fly expecting glory. They flew under the weight of immense responsibility, believing in the sanctity of their assignment. To protect Admiral Yamamoto was more than a military duty. It was an act of faith in the future of Japan's war effort. To fail him was to fail the very foundation of their command. But what haunts their legacy is not the failure itself. It's the loneliness of it. When the Americans returned to Henderson Field after the mission, there were debriefings, accolades, medals. Rex Barber and Thomas Lanphier would dispute who fired the fatal shots, but both would be hailed as heroes. Operation Vengeance became a symbol of American resolve, a calculated surgical strike, proving that even Japan's most protected leaders could be reached. For the Japanese, there was only silence. No public recognition for the escorts, no official explanation for the failure. For years, even the cause of Yamamoto's death was hidden from the public. When word finally reached the population in May 1943, the story was rewritten. He had died while directing operations at the front, a noble death, untouched by the messy reality of ambush and encryption. The men who had flown beside him were erased. It was only through the reluctant testimony of Kenji Yanaga that they were remembered at all. His insistence on naming them, not as failures but as men, rescued their story from oblivion. In his quiet words, the world came to understand that they had not failed because they were unworthy. They had failed because the system that sent them aloft was already collapsing. Looking back, the mission's failure was almost inevitable. 6 Zeros, designed in a different era, against 16 modern American fighters, guided by codebreakers and armed with the element of surprise. It was not a battle. It was a sentence. And yet, within that inevitability, those 6 men showed something that transcends outcome. They followed orders, stayed in formation, scanned the skies, and tried desperately to react when death finally arrived. They never fled. They never hesitated. In the end, perhaps that is what makes their story so tragic and so enduring. It's not a tale of epic victories or decisive turning points. It's the story of what happens when warriors, trained in old ways, are thrown into a new kind of war. A war where loyalty and courage alone are no longer enough. A war where machines, codes, and distance dictate fate. Yet still, they flew. And in that, there is a kind of honor that no defeat can erase. The story of April 18, 1943, is not just a record of who lived and who died. It is ultimately a meditation on the cost of war. on what happens when bravery collides with forces too vast to counter. 6 men flew that morning under the weight of sacred duty. Only one lived to speak its truth. The rest became names attached to a failure that was never theirs to bear alone. Admiral Yamamoto's death marked more than the loss of a commander. It symbolized the beginning of Japan's strategic unraveling in the Pacific. His was a voice of measured realism, a man who understood the industrial power of his enemy and had warned against a long war. Without him, the Japanese high command grew more reckless, more desperate, more divorced from reality. In many ways, his assassination did not merely remove a strategist, it removed a brake on Japan's decline. Yet despite the consequences, the men who tried to protect him have remained footnotes in the broader narrative of World War II. Their courage, their sacrifice, their silent suffering, these were buried under the headlines of victory and vengeance. It took decades and the testimony of a lone survivor to bring their voices back from the edge of silence. The lessons of that day extend beyond tactics and aircraft specifications. They speak to the need for humility in the face of evolving warfare, to the dangers of assuming superiority without question, to the cost of underestimating an enemy who adapts faster than tradition allows, and to the price paid when doctrine fails but duty remains. In the end, history remembers victories, but wisdom remembers the lives intertwined in defeat. The 6-0 pilots were not outflown because they lacked courage. They were outflown because the world had moved forward, and their leaders had not. So as we reflect on their mission, their loss, and the path that followed, we are left with one enduring truth. Honor does not always come with victory. Sometimes it comes in the act of rising into the sky despite knowing what waits ahead. If this story moved you, please consider giving this video a like. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories from history's hidden corners, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe honor looks like in the face of certain failure? Your voice helps keep these memories alive.